Hello, good afternoon. It is Wednesday, the 14th of July, and I am reading Life in the World Unseen by Anthony Borgia. I'm now in part 1, which is got its own heading called Beyond This Life, and this is chapter 6, and chapter 6 is entitled Some Questions Answered. Edwin told us that a very large majority of people are no sooner arrived in spirit than a burning enthusiasm overtakes them as the spirit world reveals itself to them in the new life, and they immediately want to rush back to the earth and tell the world all about it. He had already explained to me some of the difficulties in my own suggestion of returning. Another very natural tendency was to ask numberless questions upon this life in general, and he remarked that in this both Ruth and I had exercised quite an unusual restraint. Certainly I had refrained from asking too many questions, but then Edwin had explained as much as we should be able to understand as we proceeded. I confess, though, now that he broached the matter, that there were many things about which I should very much like to know. Ruth said that she had the same feeling, and that doubtless many of our queries coincided. The difficulty was where to begin. We had allowed our journeying to bring forth their own problems for Edwin's solutions, but there were other considerations of a general nature which arose from the contemplation of spirit lands as a whole. One of the first that arose to my mind as we sat on the grass with heavenly flowers around and about us was the extent of this realm in which we were now living. It reached as far as the eyes could see, and that was a great deal farther than we should ever see upon the earth plane on the finest and clearest day in the summer. This in itself was too wonderful for words, but it also gave an indication of the immensity of this particular realm, and we had only seen the tiniest fraction of it so far. We still thought in terms of earthly distances. Was there any boundaries to this realm? Did it stretch still further beyond the range of our vision? If there were any terminations, what was beyond? Could we go and see for ourselves? Certainly there was a boundary to this realm, Edwin explained to us, and we could go and see it for ourselves whenever we wished. Beyond this were other and still more realms. Each soul, as it passed into spirit, passed into that realm for which it had fitted itself when upon the earth, into that realm and no other. Edwin had in the beginning described this land as the land of the great harvest, a harvest that was sown on earth. We could judge for ourselves then whether we considered that harvest a good one or a poor one. We should find that there were others infinitely better and others infinitely worse. In plain words, there are other realms immeasurably more beautiful than that in which we were now happily living, realms of surpassing beauty into which we cannot penetrate until such time as we have earned the right to enter, either as visitors or as inhabitants. But though we may not pass into them, the glorious souls who dwell in them can come into realms of less celestial rarity and can visit us here. Edwin himself had seen some of them, and we hope to do so as well. Indeed, they constantly make visitations to consult and converse with the dwellers here, to give advice and help, to give rewards and commendations, and there was no doubt that my own matter could be placed before one of these master souls for his guidance upon it. At certain times, too, these transcendent beings made special visitations when the whole realm is celebrating a great occasion, such, for example, as the two major earth festivals of Christmas and Easter. Ruth and I were astonished at the latter, because we thought them both to be essentially of the earth. But it was the manner of celebrating them, and not the festivals themselves, which was particular to the earth. In the spirit lands, both Christmas and Easters are looked upon as birthdays. The first, a birth into the earth world, the second, a birth into the spirit world. In this realm, the two celebrations synchronize with those upon the earth, since there then a greater spiritual link between the two worlds than would be the case if the festivals were held independently of season. It is not so, however, in the higher realms, where laws of a different nature are in operation. On the earth plane, the anniversary of Christmas has remained fixed for many centuries on a certain date. The exact day of the first Christmas has been lost, and is impossible now to ascertain with any precision by earthly means when it occurred. Even where it possible, it is too late to make any alteration and practice. The feast of Easter is movable, a stupid custom, since oftentimes the chosen date bears no relation to the first and original date. There is some hope that a change will be made and the feast stabilized. In no sense are we subservient to the earth in these matters, but at the same time a foolish obstinacy would lead us nowhere. Therefore it is that we cooperate with the earth plane in our united rejoicings. The higher realms have their own very good reasons for what may seem to be a departure from a recognized order. Such reasons do not concern us until we ourselves pass to those higher states. Beyond that, two great festivals, we do not have much else in common with the earth world in the matter of feasts. The most of the latter are merely ecclesiastical feasts, which have no spiritual significance in the broadest sense, since so many are the outcome of religious doctrines, which have no application in the spirit world. The Feast of Epiphany, for example, is founded upon a very colourful story, and it was in ancient times celebrated by the people in a secular fashion as well as a religious. It is now solely religious, and of very little moment here. The Feast of Pentecost is another instance of the Church's blindness. The Holy Spirit, to use the Church's phrase, has been, is, and always will be descending upon all those who are worthy to receive it, not upon one specific occasion, but always. Both Ruth and I were interested to learn how Christmas was celebrated in these realms, since on earth, beyond a few church services, the Feast of the Nativity had developed into a secular affair, the main feature being that of prodigious eating and drinking. Edward told us that in spirit we can experience the same degree of happiness as is the case on earth, where that happiness is the outcome or expression of kindness, where our merrymaking is blended with the knowledge or the remembrance of whose great day we are celebrating. Those of us who wish, and there are many such, can decorate our houses and dwelling places with evergreen, as we were accustomed to do on earth. By evergreens, I mean those particular trees, these particular trees and shrubs that are so called on earth. Here, everything is eternally evergreen. We join together in merry company, and if it is felt that the time would not be the right without our having something to eat, then is there not a superabundance of that most perfect fruit that I have told you about, to delight the hearts of the most fastidious? But I have only told of the more personal side of this feast. It is at this time that we have visitants of the higher realms to see us, perfect beings, among whom is he whose earthly birth we are celebrating. And these beauteous souls have but to pass upon their way to fill us with such an ecstasy of spiritual exaltation as to remain with us for long after the return to their high estate. At Easter time we have similar visitations, but there is a far greater degree of rejoicing, because to us the birth into the spirit world must, by the very nature of things, be of far greater significance. Indeed, when once we have left the earth plane, we are inclined to forget our earthly birthday, since the greater contains the lesser. It is only our earthly connections, if we have any, that will serve to remind us. We have enlarged upon this subject somewhat to try to show you that we are not living in a state of fervid religious emotion for all eternity. We are human, though so many people still on the earth plane would have would have us to be otherwise. Such people will inevitably be in the same relative positions as ourselves one day, and nothing is so calculated to instill humility as the realization of what one once held as firm and decided opinions. I have digressed a little from our first topic as we threw ourselves on the grass, but in our conversation one thing led to another until we seemed to have wandered some way from our course. Mention has only been made of the higher realms. What of the lower spheres that Edwin spoke about when I referred to the boundaries of this particular realm? We could visit them whenever we desired. We can always proceed to a realm lower than our own, while we cannot always mount higher. But it was by no means advisable to wander into the lower spheres except under expert guidance or before proper tuition had been given. Before informing us more fully upon this subject, Edwin advised us to see more of our pleasant land first. And now as to what constitutes the precise boundaries of this realm. We are accustomed to a knowledge of the rotundity of the earth and to seeing with our eyes the distant horizon. In turn, contemplating this world of spirit, we must abandon in many respects that idea of distance which we measure with the eye, since distance becomes annihilated by our immensely rapid means of transit. Any suggestion of terrestrial flatness is soon dispelled by the view of hills and rolling downs. Again, the atmosphere is crystal clear and our sight is not limited by the instrument of a physical body. We are not confined to keeping our feet on the ground. If we can move ourselves laterally over these lands by the power of our thought, we can also move ourselves vertically, Edwin told us. And I must say that this had never occurred to Ruth and me as yet. We were still in some ways limited by our earthly notions and habits of thought. If we could sink beneath the waters without harm, but rather with enjoyment, then, of course, we must be able to mount into the air with the same safety and enjoyment. Ruth did not express any very keen desire to do so just yet. She preferred to wait, she said, until she had become more thoroughly acclimatized. I wholeheartedly shared her sentiments in that matter, which caused our good friendship the greatest amusement. In alluding to these features, I have done so because the earth world has always looked upon the spirit worlds as being relatively up or down. These are really considerations of highly scientific nature, and I am not competent to enlarge upon them. Moreover, as an inhabitant of these lands, my whole outlook, both mental and spiritual, had to undergo sweeping and fundamental changes, in spite of the fact that I had some small knowledge before I passed over. It is really of little moment to know the precise location of the spirit world, with its many realms or spheres. Where is the boundary between the earth world and the spirit world? Upon the instant of my passing, of which you will remember I was fully conscious, when I arose from my bed in response, the two words then must interpenetrate one another. But as I moved away under the support and able guidance of Edwin, I was conscious of moving in no definite direction. I might have been travelling up or down or along. Movement there certainly was. Edwin later informed me that I had passed through the lower spheres and unpleasant ones, and that through the authority of his mission of coming to help me into my realm, we were both fully protected from any and every direction of unpleasant influence. We were in effect completely invisible to all but those of our own realms and higher. The transition from one realm to another is gradual as far as outward appearance is concerned, as well as in other respects, so that it would be difficult to assign to any particular locality the destination of boundary. That is exactly how the boundaries of our own realms are situated. They seem to melt almost imperceptibly into one another. Edwin now proposed that, by way of practical illustration, we should go and see one of these boundaries that had perplexed us so much. We again placed ourselves under Edwin's expert guidance, and we moved off. At once we found ourselves upon a very wide expanse of grassland, but we both noticed that the turf felt less soft beneath our feet. It was, in fact, becoming hard as we walked along. The beautiful emerald green was fast vanishing, and the grass was taking on a dull yellow appearance, very similar to earthly grass that had been scorched by the sun and has lacked water. We saw no flowers, no trees, no dwellings, and everywhere seemed bleak and barren. There was no sign of human life, and life seemed to be rapidly disappearing from beneath our feet, as by now the grass had ceased altogether, and we were upon hard ground. We noticed, too, that the temperature had fallen considerably. Gone was all that beautiful genial warmth. There was a coldness and dampness in the air which seemed to cling to our beings and cast a chill over our very souls. Poor Ruth clung to Edwin's arm, and I am not ashamed to say that I did the same, and was very glad to do so. Ruth then visibly shivered and stopped abruptly, imploring us not to go any further. Edwin threw his arms around both our shoulders and told us that we had no need to be the least afraid, as he had the power to protect us fully. However, he could see the state of deep depression as well as oppression that had fallen upon us, and so he turned us gently around, placed his arms about our waists, and we once more found ourselves sitting beneath our own lovely trees with the glorious flowers close beside us, and our own warm air once more closing upon us with its heavenly balm. It is perhaps superfluous to add that Ruth and I were both glad to be back in the city. We had been only on the threshold of the lower spheres, but we had gone far enough to gather more than an inkling of what lay beyond. I knew that it would be some time yet before I would penetrate there, and I could now clearly perceive the wisdom of Edwin's admonitions. As we were on the subject of these spiritual boundaries, and in spite of the fact that we had temporarily ceased our explorations, I could not refrain from asking Edwin about the frontiers of the higher realms. I knew there could not possibly be anything unpleasant about these, and so I hinted that, by way of contrast and to offset our recent chilling experience in the other direction, we might perhaps visit the border through which our celestial visitants passed. Edwin said that there was no objection whatever, and so once again we started off. Again we found ourselves upon grassland, but with a striking difference. The turf upon which we were walking was infinitely softer than that of the interior of the realm. The green of the verdure was even brighter than we had thought possible. The flowers were growing in still greater profusion, and the intensity of colour, of perfume, and of health-giving power transcended anything we had encountered. The very air seemed to be imbued with rainbow tints. There were few dwellings at the spot where we were immediately standing, but behind us were to be seen some of the most stately and beautiful houses I have ever seen. In these houses, so our friend told us, lived wondrous souls who, though nominally belonging to our own realm, were by virtue of their spiritual progression and particular gifts and work in close contact with the higher realms, into which they had full authority and the requisite power to pass upon their various occasions. Edwin promised that we should return to this place after we had seen as much of the city as we wished, and there we could discuss in one of the houses my future work, as well as Ruth's. He had taken Ruth under his wing, and for her part she expressed her gratitude for that kindness, and for his kindness in doing so. It had several times crossed my mind what form of spiritual work I could engage myself upon, as soon as I had become sufficiently familiar with the new life and the new land. Just as we had been heavy with chill and oppression at the borderline of the dark spheres, so were we now warmed and filled with such an elation that we were almost silent in wonderment. As we moved along, bathed in radiance, we felt such a spiritual acceleration that Edwin's description of the visitations of personages from the higher realms at once came to my mind, and I almost knew what to expect when I should be fortunate enough to witness such a visitation. Standing here, one had the overwhelming desire to strive for that progression that would entitle one to inhabit one of these lovely houses, and to qualify for the honour of serving one of the dwellers in this higher sphere at whose gateway we were standing. We walked a little way forward, but we could proceed no further. There were no visible barriers, but we felt that we could not breathe if we went onwards. The whole atmosphere was becoming so much more the rarefied the further we penetrated, that in the end we were bound to retrace our steps on to our own ground. I could see many souls dressed in the most tenuous of garments, or the soft colours of which seemed hardly to belong to them, but to float about the fabric of their robes, if fabric one can call it. Those of them who came sufficiently near smiled to us with such a friendly greeting that we knew we were not in any way intruding, and some waved their hands to us. My friend told us that they were aware of our purpose there, and for that reason they would not approach us. They would allow us to enjoy our experience by ourselves and quietly to absorb the beauties and splendours of this wonderful borderland. And so rather reluctantly we turned, and we quickly found ourselves back in the city, in our former spot under the trees. We both felt more buoyant than ever after this brief visit, and I am sure Edwin did too, notwithstanding his having been in spirit so much longer than we had. We did not speak for a while after our return, each of us engaged upon our own thoughts, and when we finally broke our silence, it was to ply our good Edwin with questions. To enumerate all these questions would be tedious, so I will give in a consecutive form Edwin's answers as a whole. First, with regard to the lower spheres, those whose thresholds had so depressed us. I have since visited them in company with Ruth and Edwin, and I have made expeditions through them, just as we are now making through our own realms. I therefore do not want to anticipate what I wish to say later as to our experiences there. For the present, then, I will only say that when we paid our visit to the boundary, we made our way there directly and rapidly, and we had no consciousness of the intermediate states through which we passed. It was for this reason that our sudden change of the environment was so noticeable. Had we made our progress slowly, we should have perceived the gradual decline of all those pleasant and enjoyable features that constitute the heaven of this realm. And those who dwelt within this area of decline are in the same relative position to ourselves in respect of movement. They would be inhabited from passing higher, just as we were on the borders of that higher realm. In the same conditions obtained in our journey to the borders of the higher realms, we traversed the distance so quickly that we were unable to observe the gradual alterations in our surroundings. Otherwise, we should have seen the country taking on a higher degree of etherealization, a greater intensification of colour and brightness, observable not only in the physical features of the realm, but also in the spirit remnant of those whose homes approximated the more closely to the border. To visit the lower realms, it is necessary to have, for one's own protection, certain powers and symbols, of which Edwin told us he was in full possession. Such places are not for curiosity seekers, and no one would be foolish enough to go there for any purpose other than a legitimate one. Those who wander in that direction alone, without authority, are soon turned back by kindly souls whose work it is to save others from the perils that lie beyond. Many souls are continuously passing backwards and forwards across that sad border in the performance of their work. It is true that we saw no signs of anyone near us when we were there, but like ourselves, when we made our journey there, they moved quickly to their destination. At the border to the higher realms, there is no need for such sentinels to keep others from crossing, because the natural law prevents it. When those of a lower realm travel to a higher, it is always by authority, either vested in the traveller or in some other person of a higher sphere who will act as an escort. In the former case, such authority takes the form of symbols or signs that are given to the holder, who will always and upon every occasion receive, even unasked, every assistance he may need. Many of these symbols have the power in themselves of preserving the traveller from the overwhelming effect of the higher spiritual atmosphere. This latter would not damage the soul, of course, but a soul thus unprepared would find itself in much the same situation as upon earth when one emerges into brilliant sunlight after a prolonged stay in complete darkness. But as in the case of the earthly sunshine, one can, after a suitable lapse of time, become again perfectly at ease in the normal bright light. It is not so in the case of the higher realms. There is no such adaptability there. The blinding effect will be continuous to one of a lower state. But with a perfect dispensation, means are provided so that the visiting soul shall undergo no spiritual discomfort or unhappiness. And that is just what one would expect, since such visits are made for happy reasons and not as a test of spiritual stamina and endurance. When it is necessary to make a journey to even higher spheres, it then becomes imperative, in many cases, that an inhabitant of those realms should, as it were, throw a cloak over his charge, in just the same way as Edwin, upon a lower scale, threw his protecting arms about us when we journeyed to the lower sphere. Such, in substance, was what Edwin told us in reply to our many queries. We now felt that we were sufficiently rested, and upon Edwin proposing that we might care to resume our inspection of the city, we accordingly did so. Right, this was the end of chapter 6 of Life in the World Unseen. I will upload it on my YouTube and Vimeo and read chapter 7 tomorrow. Fascinating book. Bye.